In one corner of the city, there was an old orphanage that looked more like a prison than a place for children. Its high gray walls and rusty doors hid stories of suffering inside. Sammy had lived there since he was 5, after losing his parents in a tragic accident. The orphanage was not a place of comfort or childhood, but rather a factory where children worked all day. The headmaster of the orphanage, Mr. Graham, was a cruel and merciless man. He forced the children to do hard labor, such as scrubbing floors, carrying heavy loads, and cultivating the large backyard garden, the produce of which he sold for his own purposes. If the children did not finish their work on time, he punished them by depriving them of food or leaving them in dark rooms overnight. Jim, despite his young age, endured everything with patience. He knew that if he complained, it would only increase his suffering. However, he always dreamed of a better life outside those bleak walls. One day, a new child named Michael arrived at the orphanage. Michael was strong-willed and not afraid to speak his mind. He quickly became friends with Jim, encouraging him to rebel against the injustice faced by the children. "Jim, we can't keep living like this. We have to do something," Michael said one night as they sat in the back garden. "But what can we do? Mr. Graham will never leave us alone," Jim replied softly. Michael smiled and said, "We'll find a way." While Jim and Michael were cleaning Mr. Graham's office one day, Michael discovered a notebook hidden among the books. The notebook contained names and ages of the children, as well as notes about the tasks they were forced to do. But the biggest shock was the mention of a company Mr. Graham used to sell the crops the children grew in the garden. "He's exploiting us for money," Michael said angrily. "But how can we expose him?" "No one will believe us," Jim replied cautiously. Michael thought for a moment and said, "We need to gather evidence, and we'll find a way out of here." Jim and Michael began working in secret. At night they would watch Mr. Graham's movements and search through his papers, and during the day, they spoke with the other children, trying to convince them to stand together. One night, while everyone was asleep, the two friends sneaked into the director's office and stole some papers containing incriminating evidence. They then hid the papers in a safe place outside the orphanage. When Mr. Graham discovered that the papers were missing, he went mad. He gathered all the children in the courtyard and began shouting, "Who stole my papers? If no one speaks up, none of you will get food today." But the children, encouraged by Michael and Jim, decided to stand together. Michael shouted loudly, "Your time is over, Mr. Graham. We have the evidence, and the police will be here soon." Mr. Graham was taken aback by Michael's courage, but before he could do anything, they all heard the sound of police cars at the gate. It turned out that Jim and Michael had handed over the evidence to an employee at a nearby store, who then contacted the police. After an investigation, Mr. Graham was arrested, and the orphanage was shut down. With the police's intervention and the exposure of Mr. Graham's exploitation, Jim and Michael brought justice not only to themselves but to all the children in the orphanage. The days of cruelty and fear were finally over. Jim, once a quiet and patient boy, had found his voice. He was determined that no child should ever have to endure what he went through. He and Michael began working together, advocating for children's rights and creating a better future for others who were suffering in silence. Their bravery had changed their lives forever, and the bond between Jim and Michael grew stronger as they continued to fight for justice and a better life for all children in need. All the children were transferred to better foster homes, where they found the care they had been deprived of for years. Jim was transferred to a modern foster home run by a kind couple. For the first time in his life, he felt safe and cared for. Jim started going to school and excelled in his studies, especially in literature. He had always loved writing and found it an outlet to express all the feelings he had experienced in the orphanage. Michael was transferred to another city, but the two friends kept in touch through letters. Michael wrote in one of the letters, "Someday, Jim, we will meet again and achieve our big dreams." When Jim was 15, he began to realize that his past in the orphanage was a big part of his personality. He decided to use those experiences to become stronger. He began writing stories about children living in difficult circumstances, and he dreamed of becoming a writer one day to help change the lives of others. Even though he had found a safe home, the feeling of loneliness never left him completely. Every night, he would remember his friends in the orphanage and what they had suffered. This was his greatest motivation to work hard. When Jim was 18, he graduated from high school with honors. He received a scholarship to attend university in the field of literature and creative writing. At university, he found himself surrounded by people who appreciated his talent. He began publishing short articles and stories inspired by his childhood in local magazines. Once, he wrote a story called "Voices Behind the Walls," in which he talked about his childhood in an orphanage. The story spread widely and aroused the sympathy of many. He received an invitation from a children's charity organization to talk about his experience, and this was the beginning of his career working for orphaned children. Many years later, Jim met Michael again. Michael had become an activist in the field of children's rights, and worked with international organizations to protect children from exploitation. The two decided to work together to establish a charitable project aimed at providing education and shelter for children in need. Jim used his talent in writing to publish stories of orphaned children and their suffering, while Michael focused on providing financial and logistical support for the project. Over time, Jim became a famous writer and published several books inspired by his childhood and experience. He donated a large portion of his profits to support orphans and homeless children. At one of his book signings, a young boy approached him and said, "Your story inspired me. I used to feel like I was alone, but now I know I can be as strong as Jim." Jim smiled tenderly and said to the boy, "Always remember, your past doesn't define your future. You can be whatever you want to be." In the end, Jim lived a life full of accomplishments. From an orphaned child in an orphanage to an inspiring writer and human being who works for children. He always said to himself, The darkness I experienced as a child was not the end of the road, but the beginning of my journey towards the light.
Thank you for your wonderful support. If you have ideas or suggestions for future videos, write to me in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell. See you in the next video.